The spring of 1944, the United States faced an unprecedented agricultural crisis, as millions of able-bodied men had been deployed to European and Pacific fronts. The War Department approved Emergency Public Law 45, authorizing the employment of over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war in American farmlands under minimal supervision. What followed was one of the most unexpected social experiments of World War II. They called it impossible. German soldiers, raised on tales of American barbarism and Jewish conspiracies, now found themselves standing in Nebraska cornfields with pitchforks instead of rifles. Eric Bauer stepped off the military truck onto foreign soil that smelled nothing like war. Smelled like manure, rain, and something he could not name yet, perhaps normalcy. Around him, other prisoners whispered nervously in German, their eyes scanning the horizon for barbed wire that barely existed. Sheriff Walter Green stood before them, hands on his belt, not a weapon in sight. He spoke slowly as if addressing children, but his tone carried no contempt, only expectation. The question that would haunt Eric for decades formed silently in his mind that day. What if everything they told us about America was a lie? Eric Bauer had imagined America as a landscape of steel and violence, cities burning under the weight of their own decadence, fields soaked in the blood of inferior races. That was what the propaganda films had shown back in Hamburg, what the officers had drilled into their skulls during training. Yet here he stood, 23 years old, a prisoner of war surrounded not by guard towers and machine guns, but by wheat fields stretching endlessly toward a pale spring sky. The silence was unnerving. No shouting, no beatings, just the low murmur of American voices and the distant clucking of chickens. He clutched his small canvas bag containing his few belongings, a Bible his mother had tucked into his uniform, a broken wristwatch, and a photograph of a girl whose name he could no longer remember. Around him, other prisoners shuffled nervously, their eyes darting between the sheriff and the farmhouses dotting the landscape like promises of something dangerously close to peace. Friedrich Keller, a Wehrmacht veteran twice Eric's age, stood rigid beside him, his jaw clenched as if still on a parade ground in Berlin. Friedrich had fought in Poland and France before his capture in North Africa. He carried himself with the discipline of a man who refused to let captivity erase his identity as a soldier. When the sheriff began speaking in broken German, explaining work schedules and meal arrangements, Friedrich did not flinch. But Eric noticed the slight tremor in the older man's hands, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the brim of his cap. This was not the war they had trained for. This was something far more disorienting, a battlefield where the weapons were hose and the enemy offered coffee. Eric wondered if Friedrich felt the same creeping doubt, the same whisper that perhaps they had been lied to all along. The truck that had brought them from the processing camp in Kansas had been surprisingly comfortable, nothing like the cattle cars they had heard horror stories about. The guards had even allowed them to smoke, passing cigarettes through the mesh separating the front cabin from the cargo bed. Eric had declined, too nervous to trust the gesture, but others accepted gratefully. Now, standing in the yard of what appeared to be a modest family farm, he could smell fresh bread baking somewhere inside the main house. The scent was so achingly familiar, so reminiscent of his mother's kitchen, that his throat tightened. How could the enemy smell like home? How could captivity feel less oppressive than the trenches of Normandy, where he had spent 3 months waiting for Allied bombs to find him? Mary Thompson emerged from the farmhouse carrying a pitcher of water and a stack of tin cups. She was younger than Eric expected, perhaps 19 or 20, with auburn hair tied back in a practical bun and dirt smudges on her apron. Her eyes were cautious but not cruel, scanning the group of prisoners as if assessing livestock at auction. When her gaze met Eric's, he looked away instinctively, conditioned by months of dehumanization to avoid direct eye contact with Americans. But she did not scold him. She simply began pouring water into cups and distributing them, moving through the group with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding large gatherings. Friedrich accepted his cup without a word, drinking slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the barn. Eric took his own cup and drank deeply, the cool water washing away the dust from hours of travel. It tasted clean, unremarkable, disturbingly normal. Sheriff Walter Green clapped his hands once. a sharp sound that cut through the murmuring. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, weathered by decades of prairie sun, with a face that suggested he had seen too much to be easily impressed or easily frightened. He spoke in English now, his words translated haltingly by a young corporal who had been assigned to the group. The sheriff explained that they would work 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, with Sundays reserved for rest and religious services if they wished. They would receive 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, redeemable at the camp commissary. They would eat the same meals as the farm families, sleep in converted barns equipped with cots and stoves, and be expected to work as hard as any American farmhand. Any attempt to escape would result in immediate return to a maximum security facility. Any refusal to work would mean reduced rations and solitary confinement. But respect the rules, the sheriff said, and they would be treated fairly. Eric listened, his mind struggling to reconcile the sheriff's pragmatic tone with years of indoctrination. This was not how conquerors spoke to the conquered. This was something else entirely, something that terrified him more than barbed wire ever could. When the enemy offers you bread instead of chains, you must ask yourself, which side was I truly fighting for? The first morning arrived with the merciless punctuality of rooster, crows, and the metallic clang of a bell rung outside the barn where Eric and 19 other prisoners had spent their first night on American soil. Sleep had come in fragmented intervals, interrupted by the sounds of men weeping quietly into their pillows, others whispering prayers in German, and Friedrich pacing the length of the barn like a caged wolf. Eric had dreamed of Hamburg in flames, of his younger sister calling his name through smoke, but woke to the smell of frying bacon drifting through the cracks in the wooden walls. His stomach clenched with hunger so acute it bordered on pain. He had not eaten properly in weeks, not since the transport ship that brought them across the Atlantic. Now the aroma of an American breakfast felt like a cruel joke, or perhaps a trap. Friedrich was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot with his boots laced, staring at nothing. When Eric approached, the older man spoke without looking at him, his voice flat and distant, like a radio broadcast from another world. He said they must not forget who they were. That comfort was a weapon sharper than any blade, designed to erode loyalty and discipline. Eric nodded, but his stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. The mess hall was a converted equipment shed, long tables arranged in neat rows with benches on either side. American farmhands sat at one end, prisoners at the other, though no physical barrier separated them. Eric followed the line, accepting a tin plate piled high with scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits, and a ladle of thick gravy. His hands trembled as he carried the plate to a seat beside Friedrich. Around him, prisoners ate in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some wept openly as they chewed, overcome by the sudden abundance after months of near-starvation rations in the camps before their transfer. Mary Thompson moved through the hall refilling coffee mugs, her expression neutral but watchful. When she reached Eric's table, she poured coffee into his cup without asking, the dark liquid steaming in the cool morning air. He muttered a thank you in broken English, and she paused, surprised. She offered a small nod before moving on. Friedrich did not drink his coffee. He left it untouched, cooling on the table like a small act of defiance. The work began immediately after breakfast. Sheriff Green divided the prisoners into teams, assigning each to a different section of the farm. Eric found himself paired with Friedrich and 3 others, tasked with repairing fence posts along the northern property line. The tools felt foreign in his hands, a post hole digger, a hammer, wire cutters, instruments of creation rather than destruction. The older American farmhand supervising them, a man named Harold with a limp from the First War, demonstrated the technique once and then stepped back, lighting a cigarette and watching with the detached interest of someone who had seen enough of life not to waste energy on unnecessary supervision. He did not carry a weapon. He did not shout orders. He simply worked alongside them, occasionally correcting a mistake with a gesture rather than words. The rhythm of labor was hypnotic: dig, plant, tamp, move, and Eric felt his muscles remember movements from his childhood helping his uncle on a small farm outside the city. The sun climbed higher, warming his back through the thin cotton shirt they had been issued. The air smelled of turned earth and distant rain, clean and sharp against his lungs. By midday, the blisters had formed on Eric's palms, the soft skin unaccustomed to the rough texture of wooden handles and steel wire. Friedrich worked with mechanical precision, his face expressionless, refusing to acknowledge the sweat soaking his collar or the mud caking his boots. During the lunch break, they sat in the shade of an elm tree, eating sandwiches of thick bread and cold meat that Mary had delivered in a wicker basket. Harold sat nearby, chewing slowly and staring at the horizon. After a long silence, he spoke in halting German, surprising everyone. He said he had learned the language from a friend in the trenches of the Argonne Forest in 1918, a German-American who had died saving Harold's life. He said he did not hate Germans, only war, and that anyone who worked honestly deserved respect. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Friedrich did not respond, but Eric saw something flicker in the older man's eyes. Not agreement, but perhaps the first crack in his armor of certainty. Eric bit into his sandwich and tasted butter, real butter. And for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to wonder if survival might mean something other than endurance. The afternoon stretched long and hot, the sun relentless against the open fields. Eric's hands bled through the blisters, the raw skin stinging with each grip of the post-hole digger. He wanted to stop, to collapse in the dirt and surrender to exhaustion, but Friedrich worked beside him with the grim determination of a man fighting an invisible enemy. The older man's pride became a kind of fuel, driving Eric forward even when his body screamed for rest. By the time Sheriff Green rang the bell signaling the end of the workday, Eric could barely straighten his back. His clothes were soaked through with sweat, his boots heavy with mud, and his hands a mess of broken skin and dried blood. Yet as he trudged back toward the barn, he felt something unexpected, a strange, quiet satisfaction. He had built something today. He had contributed, and despite every instinct telling him to resist, to maintain his identity as a soldier and prisoner, he could not deny the small, dangerous pride blooming in his chest. Friedrich walked beside him in silence, and Eric wondered if the older man felt it too, the insidious warmth of being treated not as an enemy, but as a worker, as a human being. The most dangerous prison is the one that feels like freedom. Sunday arrived like a gift wrapped in silence. No bell summoned them at dawn. No tools waited in calloused hands. The prisoners woke slowly, disoriented by the absence of urgency, and found themselves facing a day without structure or purpose. Some attended a makeshift Catholic service conducted by Father O'Malley, a rotund priest from the nearby town, who spoke no German, but whose Latin prayers needed no translation. Others wandered the perimeter of the farm, testing the invisible boundaries of their captivity, marveling at the lack of armed guards and the ease with which they could, theoretically, disappear into the endless prairie. But where would they go? Canada was 1,000 miles north, Mexico equally distant south, and the landscape offered no shelter for fugitives. Eric spent the morning sitting on a wooden crate outside the barn, watching clouds drift across an impossibly blue sky and trying to remember what freedom had felt like before the war consumed everything. Friedrich emerged from the barn carrying his Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded, and sat beside Eric without speaking. They remained there for an hour, two men suspended between worlds, unable to return to what they were and uncertain of what they were becoming. Mary Thompson appeared after lunch carrying a basket of apples and a small jar of salve. She approached Eric and Friedrich with the cautious determination of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary task. She gestured to their hands, pointing at the torn skin and dried blood, and held up the jar. Eric hesitated, instinctively suspicious of charity, but the pain in his palms overrode his pride. He extended his hands and Mary unscrewed the jar, releasing the sharp medicinal scent of camphor and beeswax. She dabbed the salve onto his wounds with surprising gentleness, her fingers cool against his inflamed skin. Friedrich watched with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight, but when Mary turned to him and gestured expectantly, he too extended his hands. She worked in silence, tending to their injuries with the same efficiency she brought to every task, and when she finished, she offered each of them an apple from her basket. Eric accepted, biting into the crisp flesh and tasting sweetness so intense it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Mary did not smile, but her eyes softened slightly before she turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. Friedrich stared at the apple in his hand as if it were a live grenade, and then, slowly, he took a bite. That evening, Sheriff Green organized a small gathering in the yard, a bonfire encircled by benches where prisoners and farmhands could sit together under the stars. It was not mandatory, the sheriff explained through the translator, but those who wished to attend would find coffee, cornbread, and perhaps a bit of harmonica music courtesy of Harold. Eric expected few would participate, that the chasm between captor and captive was too wide to bridge with coffee and folk songs. But curiosity proved stronger than caution. One by one, prisoners emerged from the barn, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the novelty of an evening without confinement. Eric found a spot on a bench between two younger prisoners, boys barely 18 who spoke in hushed, excited whispers about how different America was from the propaganda. Harold produced his harmonica and began to play a mournful melody that Eric did not recognize but felt deep in his chest, a song about longing and distance that transcended language. Friedrich stood at the edge of the firelight, arms crossed, refusing to sit, but Eric noticed the older man's foot tapping almost imperceptibly to the rhythm. The conversation started tentatively. Fragments of broken German and English exchanged across the fire. Harold asked about Germany, about cities and food and what the weather was like in winter. A young prisoner named Klaus described Berlin before the bombs, the wide avenues and grand buildings, the Christmas markets that smelled of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine. An American farmhand named Tom spoke of growing up during the Depression, of dust storms that buried entire farms and left families with nothing but hope and stubbornness. The stories wove together, distinct yet strangely similar, tales of hardship, loss, and the universal struggle to protect what mattered most. Eric listened more than he spoke, absorbing the strange alchemy of shared humanity emerging around the fire. At one point, Mary joined the circle, sitting beside her father, a grizzled man in his 60s who had been too old to enlist but had sent 3 sons to Europe. Her father asked, through the translator, if any of the prisoners had fought in Normandy. Several raised their hands. He nodded slowly and said his eldest boy had died on Omaha Beach. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the weight of grief and guilt. Then the father added quietly that he did not blame the soldiers. He blamed the men who started wars and sent boys to die in them. Eric felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the wall he had built to protect himself from doubt. Later, as the fire burned low and prisoners began drifting back to the barn, Eric remained seated, unwilling to break the fragile peace of the evening. Friedrich approached and sat beside him, the older man's face shadowed and unreadable. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Friedrich said, in a voice so low Eric almost missed it, that he had a son Klaus's age, a boy who had volunteered for the Luftwaffe and whose fate remained unknown. Friedrich said he had fought in 3 wars, first as a teenager in the trenches of Verdun, then in Poland, then North Africa, and that each time he had believed he was defending his homeland, protecting his family, fulfilling his duty. But sitting here, under an American sky, eating American food, treated with American decency, he no longer knew what he believed. Eric wanted to offer comfort, to say something profound or reassuring, but words failed him. Instead, he placed a hand on Friedrich's shoulder, a gesture small and inadequate but sincere. The older man did not pull away. They sat together until the fire died, 2 German soldiers learning that the hardest battles are not fought with weapons, but with the courage to question everything you thought you knew. When the enemy becomes your neighbor, the war moves inside you. June arrived with the intensity of prairie summer, heat shimmering off the fields in visible waves and transforming labor into an endurance test. The wheat had grown tall and golden, ready for harvest, and the pace of work accelerated to match the urgency of the season. Eric and Friedrich were reassigned to the threshing crew, a team of 8 prisoners working alongside 10 American farmhands to cut, bundle, and process thousands of acres before the weather turned. The work was brutal, 12-hour days under a merciless sun, the dust from the wheat coating their lungs and skin, the repetitive motion of swinging scythes leaving their shoulders screaming with pain. Yet there was also a strange camaraderie emerging, born from shared exhaustion and mutual dependence. Harold taught Eric how to sharpen the blade properly, demonstrating the angle and pressure needed to maintain a keen edge. Tom showed Friedrich a technique for bundling the wheat more efficiently, saving precious minutes per acre. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distinction between prisoner and captor blurred in the heat and dust, replaced by the simpler categories of those who worked hard and those who did not. Mary Thompson had taken to bringing water and salt tablets to the fields twice daily, driving a battered pickup truck loaded with jugs and tin cups. She moved through the workers with practiced efficiency, ensuring everyone drank enough to avoid heat stroke. Eric found himself looking forward to her appearances, not from any romantic inclination, but because her presence represented a kind of normalcy he had thought lost forever. A woman tending to the needs of workers, unconcerned with uniforms or nationalities, focused only on the practical necessities of survival. One afternoon, as she poured water into his cup, she asked in halting German where he had learned to work so well with his hands. Eric explained, in equally broken English, about his uncle's farm, the summers spent helping with the harvest before the war consumed everything. Mary nodded thoughtfully and said her brothers had enlisted in early 1942, that the farm had nearly collapsed without them, and that the prisoner's labor was the only reason her family still had a home. The honesty of her statement caught Erich off guard. She was not thanking him. She was simply stating a fact, acknowledging an uncomfortable truth that benefited both of them. The canteen coupons they earned each week became a curious currency of autonomy within captivity. The camp commissary, a small building near the main facility 20 miles away, where they were transported each Saturday, stocked an improbable variety of goods: cigarettes, chocolate, writing paper, stamps, even cheap harmonicas and playing cards. Eric saved his coupons for 3 weeks before purchasing a small notebook and pencil. He began writing letters home, though he had no idea if they would ever reach Hamburg, if his family still lived, if his street still existed. The act of writing became a tether to his former self, a way to maintain some connection to the boy he had been before the Wehrmacht swallowed him whole. Friedrich spent his coupons on cigarettes and tobacco, smoking methodically each evening while staring at the horizon, his thoughts impenetrable and private. Klaus and the younger prisoners bought chocolate and shared it like schoolboys, laughing over silly jokes and card games, their youth reasserting itself in the absence of immediate danger. Eric envied their resilience, their ability to adapt and find joy even in captivity. He felt older than his 23 years, weighed down by questions he could not answer and doubts he could not articulate. One evening, Sheriff Green called a meeting in the mess hall, announcing that several prisoners would be selected to work on neighboring farms where labor shortages were even more acute. The selection would be based on work ethic, behavior, and the recommendations of the supervisors. Those chosen would live in smaller groups, sometimes only 2 or 3 per farm, with even less supervision. It was an extraordinary gesture of trust, Green explained, and a test of their willingness to honor their parole. The announcement sparked intense debate among the prisoners. Some, like Klaus, volunteered immediately, eager for the increased autonomy and the break from the monotony of communal living. Others, including several hardline Nazis who had maintained their ideological purity despite the humane treatment, refused outright, viewing it as collaboration with the enemy. Friedrich remained silent, his expression unreadable, but when the sheriff asked for his decision, he stood and said he would go. Eric was shocked. The older man who had resisted every gesture of kindness, who had maintained his soldiers' discipline through weeks of disorienting generosity, was now volunteering for deeper integration with the Americans. When Eric asked why, Friedrich said simply that he was tired of being a prisoner, and that if working honestly on a farm was what it took to feel human again, then he would do it. Eric signed up as well, driven by a mixture of curiosity, admiration for Friedrich's courage, and a growing desire to understand the country that had treated him with such unexpected decency. The night before their transfer to the neighboring farms, Eric lay awake in the barn, listening to the sounds of men breathing, coughing, murmuring in their sleep. He thought about the propaganda films he had watched in training, the images of American brutality and Jewish conspiracies, the promises that Germany was fighting for civilization itself against barbaric hordes. He thought about the bread Mary baked each week, the patience Harold showed when teaching them new skills, the sheriff's pragmatic fairness, and the father who had lost a son on Omaha Beach but did not blame the soldiers. He thought about Friedrich's son, Klaus's youth, and his own sister waiting in Hamburg for a brother who might never return. And he realized, with a clarity that felt like betrayal and liberation in equal measure, that everything he had been taught was a lie, not a simple lie, not a small distortion, but a fundamental systematic inversion of reality designed to turn human beings into instruments of destruction. The Americans were not monsters. They were farmers. They were fathers and brothers and neighbors trying to survive a war they did not start and protect a way of life they cherished. And if that was true, then what did it make him? What did it make Germany? The questions kept him awake until dawn, when the rooster crowed and another day of labor began. Labor that no longer felt like captivity, but something far more complicated and far more dangerous to everything he had once believed. The greatest act of resistance is not refusing to work for the enemy, but refusing to see them as one. The Miller farm sat 3 miles west of the Thompson property, a smaller operation managed by an elderly couple whose 2 sons had been killed within weeks of each other, one at Anzio, the other in the Pacific. Mr. Miller was 71, his wife 68, and they had been on the verge of selling the land when the prisoner program offered them a lifeline. Eric and Friedrich arrived on a Wednesday morning in the back of Sheriff Green's truck, their few belongings packed in canvas bags, their faces betraying a nervousness neither would admit aloud. Mrs. Miller met them at the door, wearing a flour-dusted apron and wire-rimmed glasses, her expression one of cautious assessment rather than hostility. She spoke no German, they spoke minimal English, but she communicated through gestures and tone what words could not convey, that they would be treated fairly if they worked honestly, that her home was not a prison, and that she expected them to behave like civilized men. Mr. Miller, a taciturn man whose hands shook with early Parkinson's, simply nodded toward the barn and said they would start with the morning milking. The dairy cows needed tending regardless of politics or nationality. The routine at the Miller farm was simpler, but more intimate than the larger Thompson operation. Eric and Friedrich woke at 5 each morning to milk the cows, a task that required patience and gentleness rather than brute strength. Friedrich struggled initially, his soldier's hands too rough and impatient for the rhythmic squeezing motion required. But Mrs. Miller demonstrated with surprising vigor, her weathered fingers coaxing milk from the udders with practiced efficiency. Eric found the work meditative, the warmth of the cow's flank against his forehead, the sound of milk hitting the pail in steady streams, the rich smell of hay and animal musk filling the barn. After milking, they ate breakfast in the farmhouse kitchen, a jarring intimacy that both prisoners found deeply uncomfortable at first. They sat at the same table as the Millers, eating the same eggs and bacon, drinking the same coffee, separated only by language and history. Mrs. Miller insisted on saying grace before each meal, her voice quavering with age and emotion, thanking God for the food, for the help of these young men, and for the hope that her sons were at peace. Eric found himself bowing his head not from obligation, but from something approaching reverence. The work expanded beyond the dairy as summer progressed. They repaired the roof of the chicken coop, mended miles of fence line, cleared a drainage ditch that had been clogged for 2 years, and helped Mr. Miller plant a late crop of potatoes. The old man moved slowly, his hands betraying him at critical moments, but his mind remained sharp and his knowledge of the land encyclopedic. He taught them to read the weather by the color of the dawn sky, to judge soil quality by its scent and texture, to anticipate problems before they became catastrophes. Friedrich listened with the intensity of a student absorbing military strategy, translating the old man's wisdom into principles he could understand and apply. Eric simply worked, his body growing stronger, his hands developing the calluses of a laborer rather than the trigger finger of a soldier. One afternoon, as they dug post holes in the blazing heat, Mr. Miller asked Friedrich, through painful broken German supplemented with gestures, whether he had children. Friedrich nodded and said one son, a pilot, Status unknown. Mr. Miller was silent for a long moment, then placed a hand on Friedrich's shoulder and said, in English, Friedrich did not need translated, that he hoped the boy would come home. The gesture was simple, almost meaningless, but it shattered something in Friedrich's carefully maintained armor. That night, Eric heard the older man weeping quietly in the barn loft where they slept, a sound more terrible than any artillery barrage. Mrs. Miller began teaching them English during the evenings after supper, using a children's primer she had saved from when her sons were young. The lessons were rudimentary, colors, numbers, common phrases, but she was patient and encouraging, correcting their pronunciation with gentle humor rather than frustration. Eric discovered he had an aptitude for languages, his ear catching the rhythms and patterns more quickly than Friedrich's. The older man struggled, his tongue thick with German consonants, but he persevered with the same grim determination he brought to everything. Mrs. Miller praised their efforts lavishly, her enthusiasm disproportionate to their meager progress, and Eric realized she was lonely, desperate for conversation and connection in a house haunted by the absence of her sons. Sometimes she would pause mid-lesson and stare out the window, her eyes distant and wet, and Eric would see the weight of her grief pressing down like a physical force. On those evenings, he and Friedrich would clean the kitchen without being asked, washing dishes and sweeping floors, offering the only comfort they could, their presence and their labor. Mrs. Miller never thanked them directly, but she began baking bread specifically for them, thick loaves studded with raisins and nuts, luxuries she could barely afford but insisted on sharing. The mail came twice a week, delivered by a rural carrier who also served as the local gossip conduit. In late July, a letter arrived for Friedrich bearing Swiss Red Cross markings. His hands shook as he opened it, his face draining of color as he read the cramped handwriting. Eric watched, afraid to ask, until Friedrich finally spoke, his voice hollow and distant. His son was alive. He had been shot down over England, his leg badly burned, but he had survived the crash and was recovering in a POW camp in Scotland. The British were treating him well. He was learning English. He wanted his father to know he was proud to have served Germany. Friedrich folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, then walked out of the barn and stood in the field for over an hour, motionless under the darkening sky. When he returned, his eyes were red, but his expression was calm, almost serene. He told Eric that his son's survival changed everything, that he now had a reason to endure, to cooperate, to make it through the war and return home. But more than that, he said, the letter confirmed what he had been afraid to admit, that the British, like the Americans, were not the monsters the propaganda had promised. They were simply men doing their duty, treating prisoners with the same decency that Friedrich was experiencing here in Nebraska. The realization did not bring joy. It brought a crushing sense of waste, of all the years spent fighting for a lie, of all the lives destroyed in service of madness. Eric had no words to offer, so he simply sat beside Friedrich until the stars emerged. Two German soldiers learning that redemption and grief are inseparable companions. To discover your enemy's humanity is to confront the inhumanity of your own cause. August brought the county fair, a week-long celebration of agriculture and community that transformed the small town into a carnival of noise and color. Sheriff Green arranged for selected prisoners, those who had demonstrated exemplary behavior and integration, to attend under minimal supervision, a decision that sparked fierce debate among both Americans and Germans. Eric and Friedrich were among the chosen, along with Klaus and 6 others from the original Thompson Farm group. They wore civilian clothes provided by their host families, simple shirts and trousers that erased the visible markers of their status as prisoners. As they walked through the fairgrounds, passing families eating cotton candy and children shrieking with delight on the carousel, Eric felt simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, anonymous in the crowd, yet acutely aware that his accent would betray him the moment he spoke. Friedrich walked beside him with military posture, his eyes scanning the environment with habitual vigilance, but even the older man seemed affected by the atmosphere, his lips curving into something approaching a smile when a pig escaped its pen and caused pandemonium among the livestock exhibitors. Mary Thompson found them near the agricultural pavilion, where farmers competed for ribbons in categories ranging from largest pumpkin to best preserved pickles. She was dressed in a pale blue sundress rather than her usual work clothes, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Eric barely recognized her. She greeted them with surprising warmth, introducing them to her friends as the workers who had saved her family's farm, omitting any mention of their nationality or status. The friends, young women Mary's age, responded with polite curiosity rather than hostility, asking questions about Germany and life before the war with the innocent directness of people who had never traveled beyond their county borders. Klaus, whose English had improved dramatically, charmed them with stories about Berlin nightlife and university pranks, carefully editing out any reference to Nazi ideology or military service. Friedrich remained mostly silent, but when one young woman asked if he had family, he spoke at length about his son, the pilot recovering in Scotland, and his hope that both his boy and the war would survive long enough for them to reunite. The young woman, whose brother was serving in France, listened with tears in her eyes and said she would pray for Friedrich's son. The moment was so achingly ordinary, so profoundly human, that Eric felt his throat tighten with emotions he could not name. The evening culminated in a dance held in the high school gymnasium. Big band music played by a local ensemble, filling the space with brassy exuberance. Eric had not danced since before his conscription, and even then his skills had been mediocre at best. But when Mary asked if he would like to try, the question delivered in her improving German with an encouraging smile, he could not refuse. They moved awkwardly through a swing dance, Eric counting steps in his head while trying not to trample her feet, Mary laughing at his concentration and gently correcting his rhythm. Around them, other couples spun and swayed, Americans and Germans mixing with a casual ease that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Sheriff Green stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, watching with the satisfied expression of a man whose gamble had paid off. At one point, an elderly veteran of the First World War approached Friedrich and, speaking in rusty German, asked the older man to dance with his wife because the veteran's arthritis prevented him from doing so himself. Friedrich accepted with solemn grace, leading the woman through a slow waltz with the formal precision of a Prussian officer at a state ball. The gymnasium fell silent, watching this strange tableau, a German prisoner of war dancing with an American grandmother, while her veteran husband looked on with approval. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, and for a moment the war seemed very far away. The drive back to the Miller farm occurred in contemplative silence, Eric and Friedrich seated in the bed of Sheriff Green's truck, under a sky dense with stars. The evening had been surreal, a glimpse into a world where nationality and politics mattered less than shared humanity and common decency. Eric thought about Mary's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had treated him not as a prisoner or even as a German, but simply as a young man learning to dance. He thought about Friedrich's unexpected grace on the dance floor, the way the older man's military bearing had transformed into something almost courtly. He thought about Klaus's easy charm, and the young women who had listened to their stories with genuine interest, rather than suspicion. And he realized that what he was feeling was not gratitude or relief, but something far more dangerous, the beginning of attachment, of investment in a place and people that should have remained alien and hostile. He was starting to care about this community, to see himself not as a temporary prisoner, but as a participant in their struggles and celebrations. The realization terrified him because it meant acknowledging that Germany, the homeland he had fought for and nearly died defending, no longer held the same gravitational pull on his identity. Mrs. Miller waited for them on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill despite the summer heat. She asked, through gestures and the few German words she had learned, whether they had enjoyed the fair. Friedrich answered in careful English, describing the dance and the unexpected kindness of the veteran. Mrs. Miller nodded, her eyes glistening in the porch light, and said that her husband had fought in France during the First War, that he had killed Germans and been wounded by Germans, but that he bore no hatred toward them because war made enemies of men who might otherwise have been friends. She said her sons had died fighting Germans, and the grief was a weight she would carry until her own death. But she did not blame Erich or Friedrich, because they were not the architects of the conflict, merely its victims. She said the world would need men like them, men who had seen the cost of hatred and chosen differently, to rebuild what the madmen had destroyed. Then she went inside, leaving Erich and Friedrich standing in the darkness, her words echoing like a benediction and a burden. That night, Erich added a new entry to his notebook, writing in German because some thoughts could not yet be translated. I came to America as a prisoner. I am leaving as something else. I do not yet have a word for what that something is, but I know I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. Home is not where you were born, but where you are finally seen as fully human. September arrived with the first hints of autumn, the oppressive heat yielding to cooler mornings and the prairie grass shifting from green to gold. The harvest was nearly complete, the wheat safely stored in silos and barns, and a sense of accomplishment permeated the community. For Erich and Friedrich, the approaching end of the growing season brought an unexpected melancholy. They had spent 4 months at the Miller farm, 4 months of labor and language lessons and slow integration into a rhythm of life that felt almost normal. But normalcy was an illusion. They were still prisoners of war, still subject to repatriation whenever the conflict ended, still Germans in a country whose sons were dying to defeat their homeland. The contradiction gnawed at Erich during the long evenings as he sat on the porch with Mr. and Mrs. Miller, listening to radio broadcasts about Allied advances through France, and wondering whether his family in Hamburg still lived, whether his city still stood, whether the Germany he would eventually return to would bear any resemblance to the one he had left. Mrs. Miller must have sensed his turmoil because she began teaching him to preserve food, canning tomatoes and beans, making jam from the last of the summer berries, domestic skills that seemed absurdly irrelevant to his situation, but gave his hands something to do while his mind struggled with impossible questions. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered with the usual mail but bearing German military markings forwarded through the Red Cross. Friedrich opened it with trembling hands, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and finally something approaching horror as he read. His son had been released in a prisoner exchange due to the severity of his injuries. He was back in Germany, recovering in a hospital in Munich. But the letter contained more than medical updates. His son wrote about Germany's situation, the collapsing infrastructure, the constant Allied bombing, the food shortages, the whispered rumors of atrocities that even loyal soldiers could no longer deny. He wrote about friends who had returned from the Eastern Front with stories so terrible they refused to speak them aloud, about concentration camps whose true purpose was becoming impossible to conceal, about a regime whose promises of glory had delivered only destruction and shame. He wrote that he was proud his father was in America, away from the madness, and that he hoped Friedrich would find a way to stay there, to not come back to a country that had betrayed everything decent men believed in. Friedrich read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He did not speak for the rest of the day, working with mechanical precision, his face a mask of anguish. That evening he showed the letter to Erich and asked what they were supposed to do with knowledge that condemned everything they had fought for. Erich had no answer. The community organized a harvest festival at the Thompson farm, a celebration of successful crops and survival through another difficult year. Prisoners and farmers worked together to erect tables in the yard, string lights between the trees, and prepare food in quantities that seemed obscene given the rationing Erich knew was occurring in Europe. Sheriff Green announced that this would be the last major gathering before many of the prisoners were transferred to other locations. Camps closing, labor needs shifting, the end of the war approaching though no one could predict when. The announcement cast a shadow over the festivities, everyone aware that friendships forged over months of shared labor were about to be severed. Mary found Erich standing apart from the crowd, his expression distant, and asked what he was thinking. He tried to explain in his improving English the guilt of eating well while his family starved, the confusion of feeling more at home in enemy territory than in his own country, the fear that repatriation would mean returning to a Germany that no longer existed, or perhaps never had. Mary listened without interruption, then said something that Eric would remember for the rest of his life. That home was not a place but a collection of people who saw you clearly and chose to keep you anyway. And that if he wanted, Nebraska could be that home once the war ended and bureaucracy permitted. The offer was impossible, impractical, probably illegal. But the fact that she had spoken it aloud changed something fundamental in Eric's understanding of what might be possible. October brought the first frost and the gradual winding down of agricultural work. Eric and Friedrich helped Mr. Miller prepare the farm for winter, repairing the barn roof, insulating the chicken coop, storing equipment under tarps and covers. The old man moved even more slowly now, his Parkinson's worsening, and both prisoners understood without discussion that they were no longer simply workers, but caretakers, ensuring that the Miller farm would survive another season. Mrs. Miller's health had also declined, a persistent cough that she dismissed as seasonal, but that kept her up at night and left her exhausted during the day. The prisoners took over more of the household tasks, cooking simple meals, doing laundry, cleaning, crossing boundaries that would have been unthinkable months earlier. One evening, as Eric helped Mrs. Miller into her chair by the fireplace, she grasped his hand and said in halting German that he and Friedrich had become like sons to her, that their presence had made bearable a grief that had nearly destroyed her, and that she would petition for them to be allowed to stay permanently once the war ended. Eric felt tears burning his eyes and could only nod, too overcome to speak. Friedrich, standing in the doorway, removed his cap and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect and gratitude that transcended words. The news came in early November, delivered by Sheriff Green with an expression of regret. The war in Europe was approaching its endgame. Germany was collapsing, repatriation procedures were being organized, and prisoners would begin returning home within months. Eric and Friedrich would be transferred back to the main processing camp in Kansas by December, and from there, eventually shipped back across the Atlantic to a country that existed now only in memory and rumor. The announcement felt like a death sentence and a liberation in equal measure. Eric wanted to stay, to build a life in this place that had treated him with unexpected decency. But he also longed to find his family, to know whether they had survived, to fulfill his obligation to the people who had given him life. Friedrich was more pragmatic, understanding that choice was an illusion, that they would go where government sent them and hope that something recognizable remained on the other side. Their last weeks at the Miller farm passed in a haze of melancholy routine, work performed with extra care, meals eaten with deliberate slowness. Conversations stretched long into the evenings as if words could delay the inevitable. On their final night, Mrs. Miller gave each of them a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, photographs of the farm, a jar of her preserves, and a letter written in English that she made them promise not to read until they were on the ship home. Mr. Miller shook their hands with his trembling grip and said simply that they had been good men, and good men were always welcome in America. Eric and Friedrich left at dawn, riding in the back of Sheriff Green's truck one last time, watching the Miller farm disappear behind the horizon, carrying with them the impossible weight of having discovered that the enemy, in the end, had been the ones who taught them what it meant to be human. War makes enemies of strangers. Peace reveals they were neighbors all along, separated only by the lies of men who never had to fight. Years later, long after Germany surrendered, and the prisoners returned to a homeland reduced to rubble and shame, Erich Bauer stood in the ruins of Hamburg holding his sister's hand and reading Mrs. Miller's letter for the 100th time. She had written that the world would need men who had seen both sides, who understood that nationality was an accident of birth, but character was a choice, who could build bridges across the chasms that hatred had carved. She had written that he would always have a home in Nebraska if he wanted it, that the paperwork was complicated, but not impossible, that America needed farmers who understood the value of hard work and honest labor. It took Eric 3 years to save enough money, 3 years of working in reconstruction crews and night schools, learning English and American immigration law, writing letters across the Atlantic to people who had no obligation to remember him. But they did remember. Mary Thompson sponsored his visa. Sheriff Green provided a character reference. And in 1948, Eric Bauer stepped off a ship in New York Harbor not as a prisoner, but as an immigrant, carrying everything he owned in a single suitcase, and Mrs. Miller's letter folded in his breast pocket. Friedrich never made it back. He died of tuberculosis in a displaced persons camp in 1947, but not before writing his son a final letter, urging him to remember that the greatest loyalty was not to flags or governments, but to the truth, and that America had taught him what Germany had forgotten, that honor lay not in victory, but in how you treated those who had no power to demand your decency. Eric kept that letter too, and decades later, when his own children asked what he had learned from the war, he would tell them the story of German prisoners working on American farms, of enemies who became neighbors, and of the strange, painful grace of discovering that everything you had believed was wrong, and that being wrong was the first step toward finally being human. The war ended when the shooting stopped. The healing began when former enemies chose to remember each other not as combatants, but as men who had shared bread and toil under the same sun.